Hi, folks. Thanks so much for developing that presentation. I know that this chapter in particular it's quite challenging in the fact that it utilizes so much court case and legalese as a way to explore kind of the inherent discriminatory practices that are found, at the top from the Supreme Court all the way down to prosecutors. And so, it can be really challenging to try to understand the implicit bias that is kind of permeating even into what seems to be like race neutral articulations of law. And I think you did a really terrific job beginning to unpack that. Um, and in many cases, you have a lot of good profiling material around what each of the cases kind of addressed specifically. And that'll be really useful for kind of having it be visualized among your peers. In general, one of the things that would be important to do is to, whenever you're looking at a case profile, to kind of also articulate the implications of it. Like, okay, what ultimately does, this particular case either justify or authorize, right, for kind of further examinations or further practices in law. So I'm just going to kind of go through each of you in order, not necessarily critiquing you as individuals, but your sections, okay? In Evan's sections, first of all, I love that Carlos Thomas image because just having the image like that somehow allows us to kind of see the overall arching themes that are being explored there. And there was a lot of good material in here. Now, at least provide some context as to why you include the Aaron Swartz mention, because we definitely have the profile, but then what is its significance? Again, I'm kind of bringing that up. I think it's really good to always have an implication or a takeaway that you have presumed just from the existence and study of that particular case. It always helps for the rest of your peers to kind of get a handle on exactly why Alexander is implementing that particular case as illustrative example. There were some really nice integrations of other discussions we've had in the class to tether these ideas, specifically the implicit bias that we found around indigenous culture and how feathers were the first image that came to mind. It's nice how you kind of brought those two ideas together. It's good synthesis. With the Friend versus US case, you definitely want to provide some context with that. We kind of have mention of it, but we're not exactly sure what it is signifying, right? So again, one of those places where you can just kind of bring in some brief contextual examination. In John's section, first of all, are you sick or are you on Quaaludes? You sounded so tired and listless. I hope you're physically okay. So there is so much interesting information here. And John, I think you did a good job at how the police forces in many parts of the country, and certainly prosecutors and the lower level courts, began to racialize certain aspects of drugs. And I think you did a good job kind of highlighting how crack cocaine was always affiliated with the black community and cocaine was affiliated with the white community, and how the white community typically wasn't charged for their drug offenses. So that was really strong and super interesting. It would be interesting to provide some context around, how that racialization was done, maybe just through circumstances. And you even asked the question, like, why has that been, like, why was that administered? And so it would be interesting to maybe dig up a little bit of information around that. Also, the Edward Clary case, what is the takeaway? Again, we're getting at those implications. It's really good to think about the implications of a case, and that would be another way to do that. Like, what is that particular takeaway from the Clary case? And then with the Armstrong circumstance, yeah, you raised some questions in me that I think would be worth investigating. Why are state courts more lenient than federal courts? Um, Alexander does touch on it. I think it would be important to include it in this particular examination. Um, and then also to clarify for us, how are cases determined state or federal? That might be really important to understand because we could then realize just how much bias can integrate into the choices that are made within the criminal justice system, right? Because it's somewhat relatively arbitrary how some cases are made state and some cases are made federal, right? Cool. And Emily, in your section, again, we have a lot of good work here, and you narrativize really well the sections that you've been charged with. In the sections on peremptory strikes, for example, I'm really fascinated with some things. Like, for example, why is it still so easy to strike blacks from jury selection? What is the rationale that is employed? We know it's being done, and you articulated that, right? But what is the race-neutral rationale that is employed? And, you go into the kind of circumstance of it with the peremptory strikes. Give examples of what that looks like a little bit more. You kind of, allude a little to, Perkett versus Elm and this idea that mustaches and beards had something to do with it. But again, give the race-neutral rationale for exactly how a prosecutor in the jury selection can make those peremptory strikes. We need to know the law of the land and how they rationalize it in order to understand the implications and, of course, how unjust it is, right? So again, go into further significance of the Perkett versus Elm. And in another section, you said you talked about how the Supreme Court actually authorized race discrimination, but you don't go into how. And that would be important to kind of highlight. Like, what is actually the official way that the Supreme Court has authorized race discrimination? Excellent. By the way, there was very nice work with the unconventional wisdom section. Nice job there. Vatsal, in your section, I wanted to highlight one thing that you did really well, which was to bring in these illustrative data graphs. Because while you were talking, we could get a glimpse at something that was relevant, not precisely on what you were talking about, but relevant enough that we could then look at this kind of quantitative data as a way to synthesize ideas. So I thought that was a very strategic use of images. Good job there. In the LA case that you highlight, I think it would be good to clarify it a bit. It was a little vague in the presentation, and obviously there's a lot of really good information that you're exploring there. So clarify that a little bit more. And then the questions that you all had at the end, there was some really interesting ones, especially the first two. I thought they're incredibly compelling. I would love to integrate them into the discussions more. Some people did respond to them, but I would love to come back to those, in a collective device. And of course, unfortunately, we don't have the ability to all be together, which sucks. But I would love to explore them. In the last question, though, I was a little confused as to what you meant. The language is a little vague, and I think it would be important to specify that a bit. Overall, though, really noble job at trying to work with such legalese and, to work with so many instances of cases. I think one thing that would be good for you all to do as a group would be to kind of wrap up as a whole. Like, what does this entire chapter do ultimately? Again, the implications and the takeaway. Let's make sure that we don't spend too much time only in the details, but how it works in the overall scheme of things. I think that's what the presentations have the ability to do, and it would have been nice to see you all do that more, meaning collaborating a little bit more on kind of the discussions of, through this investigation, through the progression of information, what ultimately are we left with? What is our takeaway fully, so that we can then move into the next chapter. Good job, you all, and thanks so much for your work.